All right. Well, I'd like to invite the panelists, Pranav, Doug, Lyle, Michal. Welcome. A couple of the questions actually touched on what we are going to be discussing in this panel. So it's all about 5G and where and how we can use open source to realize the 5G vision. Maybe I'll have a quick round of introductions. I'll let each and every one of you introduce yourselves, and then very quickly I'll try to set the stage as to what the 5G vision is. And on that vision, then we can start discussing where open source fits and what are potential transformation points or points of struggle in terms of moving towards a deployment that includes lots of open source.
Okay. So I'm Pranav Mehta from Intel. I was part of Intel's embedded and networking group for many, many years, more than probably I care to admit, but let's say more than 2 decades, and has been part of this journey for network transformation over those years. Last few years, I've been part of Intel Labs, and my team really focuses on how to virtualize some of these really, really critical virtual network functions. And the OMEC work that we talked about was something that we are very involved with moving forward to the COMEC stuff as well.
Hi, I'm Doug Ng, AT&T. Most of my work is right now centered around 5G system architecture and convergence. And convergence is both within the 5G system architecture as well as different access technologies. I've also been around for a while. It's been roughly 20 some odd years on mobility or wireless cores. These are not all 3GPP at the time, but I'm really excited to look at now this finally we get to a point where open source is a possibility in taking advantage of technology for our customers.
Hi, I'm Lyle Bert. I'm from Sprint, and the current group I'm in works on technology innovation and architecture for core and services. So we're focused on the wireline, as well as the wireless cores, as well as services above them. And so my team specifically, with respect to OMEC, actually worked with Intel and Pranav's team, and quite a few folks here in the room as well, to do the initial contribution of the EPC, C3PO, NGIC, some of the sub-repos that are now part of OMEC, and we continue to develop those out today. And I think what I'm excited about is we're seeing a lot of this code starting to make it toward field trials. I'm starting to actually hear things like certification and acceptance, which is kind of exciting. And I'm looking forward to how it's going to progress over the next couple of years.
And Maikel Sewera. So actually for the last 16 years, I'm working within Deutsche Telekom. And last 7 years, I'm purely working on these shared services. So the concept of the shared services is like we are taking whatever technology it is and we are transferring it into a production network considering a full DevOps cycle. And this is exactly reflecting to my colleagues the same goal and the same job which we are doing in the context of an open source. So I'm absolutely thrilled and passionate about the concept of having a really open source network working as a core, as an EPC core. And actually, together with Sprint, we are trying to push this significantly. So within T-Mobile, actually, we are having a trial of something which is called lightweight EPC, so a very specific fixed mobile substitution use case. And that is specifically the most important effort which the team which I am heading for is working for the last months. That's more or less the background.
Perfect. Thank you. So before actually we start discussions, I thought it would be good to set the stage as to what really we should be expecting from 5G. So as we are migrating from LTE to 5G, actually the overall network is going through a transformation. So that transformation has started with first virtualization. So to a large extent, most of the operators that you see here have gone through virtualizing their mobile cores. These increasingly are now being hosted at where we would call telco clouds. And along with these cores, you would have telco applications being hosted there as well. But the next phase of this transformation is going to actually extend the reach of the telco cloud towards the edge. One immediate benefit that we are going to see from this is the virtualization of the RAN. And there were a couple of questions about that as well. And that RAN, if the ORAN Alliance vision materializes, is going to be split three ways. So we are going to see radio units sitting at antenna sites, distributed units at cell sites, and the central unit, most likely in a CUPS environment, sitting at the edge. But in addition to that, the main reason why you would want to have an edge presence is to give the operators the capability for providing service to new business verticals or new use cases, which demand more lower latencies, higher bandwidths, or traffic localizations. So when those use cases are in question, that means we also need to start thinking about distributing the mobile core, specifically pushing the user plane close to the edge for local breakouts. After that, clearly the applications which will be demanding those lower latencies or traffic localizations will get to enjoy local breakouts by being hosted at the edge as well. And last but not least, operators want to have more control over networks. So an important aspect of that is the software-defined control of the RAN. So when that is the case, the RAN controller will actually need to be present there as well. So just to set the open source angle, I would like to use ONF as an example. And here, on this overall vision, we have 3 points where we, in a complementary way, try to inject open source into this platform. One is following, again, the ORAN vision and standardization. We're starting to develop an SD-RAN solution based on ONOS. And two, we have our own disaggregated, CUPS-compliant open source EPC that we call OMEC. And three, for the overall edge cloud, we have a platform that enables a hybrid cloud connectivity as well as FCAPS capabilities and software-defined control of the fabric as well as the RAN. And there are lots of other open source platforms that actually augment this. I mean, there is, if you look at the overall picture, the overall automation orchestration is being led by another open source consortium called ONF. There is the specific build process using blueprints that you have with Acreno. There are also underlying open source components which manage cloud, etc. So there is a whole group of open source communities and solutions that are popping up. Because at the end of the day, I think moving from LTE to 5G is turning the network into a network cloud. And the minute we start viewing it as such, then there are lots of moving parts and there are lots of different components that we can pick and choose from the open source. So with this, maybe the first question that I would like to ask you is, in this whole plethora of open source solutions, I mean, a couple of you already gave the answer, but which components are you focusing initially on in moving even towards a production solution with open source in the 5G space? So maybe we can start with Michal.
Okay, so I was already mentioned this lightweight EPC use case. I'm always a big fan of the theory like start small and learn fast and grow fast. And actually, I think that we can really learn a lot from what happened in the pure IT industry with the open source adaptation. And I think that the EPC use case is really a very good one because there is a huge investment demand. We all heard on the initial session that we are still on this exponential growth with the traffic. So investments from an operator side are really huge. On the other side, what is really quite funny, if you will think about the complexity of business models, I started when we was always discussing about this smart pipe, super complex scenarios, etc. Right now, what is really successful, and we see it specifically in Europe, is really absolutely flat fee. So fixed mobile substitution is one of such a segments. I mean, statistically, in fixed mobile substitution, we have the proportion like half of the traffic generated in a network is consumed by, I don't know, maybe 10% of the users. That's sort of a fraction. Yeah? And that is creating perfect opportunity for the use case like open source because we can easily experiment it. It's very simple because we don't have all these funky, sophisticated features. And it creates a certain momentum to really build on top. So if I would be asked like what to start, I think that is perfect use case because it's really getting an initial savings for an operators, and it's always about money. Secondly, it's building a tangible starting point to learn and to prove that this can work. If this can work on a large scale, we can prove that maybe more complex mobile broadband scenarios, including DPI, can be adopted later. That would be my sort of an attempt. And that is, by the way, something within T-Mobile we are trying to accomplish.
Okay. And so for us at Sprint, right, we're focused on the gateway. But what was interesting about the gateway is we have to remember that protocol is carried forward from 4G to 5G. So it's one of the few places where we can point and say, look, if we do work there, it really carries forward and its value goes in for several years. The other interesting thing is we wanted to make sure that, as we kind of went through this whole control user plane separation and SDN was coming in, it is coming in strong, that we had a clear understanding of how that was really going to move us from 4 to 5 in a nice, easy way. So we decided, if you will, to pick on the SAE gateway. Now, as far as the use case, it would be very uninteresting to do something centralized. So we've also then pushed kind of that local breakout at the edge, as you've described in the slides so eloquently. And we really think it's interesting because we're forcing ourselves in that project to change nothing else in our network. So if you can imagine, we're not allowed really to have any benefits of the new specs, and we're not allowed to make any significant changes in the network, yet we're trying to realize a use case that's more than 4G, but not quite 5G. So there's a lot of things we're learning in terms of just trying to get the code to the point that we're happy with where it's at.
From AT&T, so I'm actually several different layers here. So for 5G specifically, we are already using, sort of ONF and, OpenStack. There's a lot of open source software just fundamentally part of everything we do going forward. So it's hard to, I was sort of thinking about what are we not doing with open source as opposed to what we are doing. Today, the software we're using for the gateways for 5G is a commercial product. We are starting, I think it's 3 or 4 open source sort of lab projects, lab trials in different parts of our company to try to figure out what's the next scenario. So Sprint and T-Mobile Poland are looking at 2 critical strategies, and we're going to try to see whether those fit into AT&T's plans or other ones. But it's clear that at least for me, that open source, user plane functions are going to be part of our long-term strategy, which we're also going to be seeing, hopefully, places where we cannot easily look at a product and say it's commercial, because commercial really is going to be a packaging of different open source solutions and capabilities, whether it be databases or forwarding technology or DPI functions or whatever. So I think to me it's more of a question of what's not going to be open source as opposed to what is.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think some people might be wondering why we have 3 operators and Intel on this stage.
That was a good one.
From Intel perspective, let me, before I come to the notion of open source, what I would like to, the way I think about this is, it is about the open platforms. So open source happens to be one component of that. But open platforms has been part of our DNA since I joined Intel more than 3 decades ago. So, and the whole idea is that if you have open platforms, what it really allows is acceleration of innovation beyond yourself or beyond a group of people, because you really enable everybody in the ecosystem to innovate on those open platforms. So when we started on this journey for network transformation, we knew that people had these siloed, vertically integrated boxes for a reason, because they provided certain features and capabilities. So our focus was that, can we enable an open platform like Intel architecture-based platforms to do those kind of things? And we really had to get into understanding where the bottlenecks were with our existing platforms back then. And open source was one easy way to understand and create workloads that would approximate those commercial software, and then really understand the bottlenecks and improve those over the last several years, where we have now gotten to a point where people can look at a standard high-volume server platform and say, yeah, it could actually do a lot of these things that I used to be able to do with a vertically integrated box. So for us, open source and participating in these type of communities is really about growing that pie so that we can attract more and more people to come to these open platforms and bring their innovation and accelerate this transformation.
Wonderful. So Michal and Lyle, you both are on the path towards field trials. So on that front, one question for you. Now that probably 10 years ago, this would have been unheard of. Now that operators are talking very comfortably about the fact that at least parts of 5G is going to be open source usage. How does that impact your overall vendor ecosystem? Does this mean also that that is also going through some sort of transformation along with open source? And how actually in that space, how do you view the different components? Is that ecosystem also going through some disaggregation so that for different parts you have now different vendors and maybe a systems integration? How you view as an operator, the overall business side of things, how has that changed?
Okay, so there's a lot there. So my first thought is, what's interesting about proposals, so let's roll the clock really far back, right? So the word Linux, right, for a long time was almost laughable in a production network, especially when you said things like Linux and high availability, right? A lot of people were very skeptical. Now it's kind of a foregone conclusion. Most operators, at least I hope most operators, are on OpenStack or have a modern system and have moved down toward virtualization. So we still see, right, the core open source in a lot of the offerings. So Linux is there. You see OpenStack there as core. We then see value-added services on top of that, extensions, other things happening in the offering. What's interesting as we're moving toward 5G is the questions we're allowed to ask and the responses we're getting when we talk with our suppliers. it was really hard to ask questions, probably even 7, 8 years ago, in terms of what open source libraries you use, because the fear I think a lot of people had was, well, wait, they're worried about GPL, or the operator's worried about, some sort of stability, right? It didn't have the reputation or the credibility. Now what's interesting is when we ask, or we don't even have to ask, a lot of people say we use this open source or that. What's even more interesting with 5G is the OS is probably some form of open source. The libraries are there, and entire components are completely open source. We're using Apache this or something from ONF. And so you then see the service sort of wrapped around that. So it's really kind of moved on to just entire pieces of software standing on their own, either tools like Kafka, or active message buses, those sort of things, Grafana, or we see like Apache Geode and stuff actually being used as the databases, right? And so clearly, as an operator, we want services on top of that. We're looking for support unless we've got our own teams, right? You really have to make that decision on your own. I think the next evolution, though, is really when do we see the network functions? I think in SDN it's a foregone conclusion, but when do we see the network functions in the signaling layer become complete open source components with that wrapping? Not sure we're quite there yet. That really depends on, I think, us and the community here to kind of make that happen. But we're getting there. It's almost everything will be there, but we'll still want, by the way, nobody goes away. We still want that support, that surety, right? Even if we feel like we have all of that knowledge, this doesn't change a lot in terms of the sourcing. As far as other players, I don't know. That always, to me, boils down to the bigger business deals. And for the cores, which I can speak to, I don't think that's as big of a deal as I would be more interested in seeing what's happened in terms of other players, non-traditional players on the RAN. Because that's where the bulk of the spend is for a mobile operator. And that's probably where you'll have a significant impact to the overall ecosystem. So I'd be curious to see what happens there, and I wish I could speak to it, but not sure right at this point.
All right. I like the question very much because in the recent years, actually, I was fully involved in trying to answer this question, but from the perspective of the relationship with the traditional supplier. So the traditional scenario was like, okay, I am an operator, you are a supplier R&D center, and here you have my 3,000 RFQ questions, and I love to call this model like please provide model, because please provide was a classical scenario, like operator was fully defended, it was thousands of questions, there was a magic SLA contract, and I'm sitting in my comfortable chair, I'm fully secured, and I have my magic documents, and there is this bloody vendor, and they just need to fulfill the requirements. I think that what happened in recent years, and that very much corresponds to one of the sessions when we have this P1, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, is that changing of this paradigm. Because operators started to think about like, oh, no, I would like a little bit control. So, I will create you an open stack. You will be responsible only for operators. But still, you are fully responsible. Yeah? And that is not working like this. I think that the key story to understand the transition to open source is that you cannot take control on certain things without taking responsibility. And I think that if I will try to point out to the one single statement, the answer for your question, that will be exactly it. Ability for an operator to change the mindset for something like, okay, I am right now an active part of this entire change. So for example, we are working heavily with Intel as a part of ONF, and my team members are writing sometimes code changes actually to verify or to test certain things. So first of all, full transparency that we need to understand the code. We are fully working not in a model of black box like, no, those are my requirements and you just need to fulfill. No, I need to really understand. We have a lot of discussions like, okay, DPDK versus zero copy, going into down little details, knowing really an engineering. And on the other side, I think that this is really creating a perfect opportunity for operators, especially those operators who are working globally, like Deutsche Telekom, because then the classical model for something which is called shared service center can be perfectly fulfilling an accelerator and integrator role for an open source. And that is exactly how I see the role of my team, that we could actually take this software, do this collaboration with R&D, build all the machinery for orchestration, for testing it, and actually go and onboard this to local so-called NATCOs. And I think that that is exactly the model how I would like to see the entire opportunity shifting. So more responsibility on an operator side, more engagement in real development, and then real active participation without this only please provide sort of uncomfortable chair scenario, let's call it like this. Yeah.
Maybe following up, Pranav, I can ask you, over the years, you have always, as Intel, been very, very involved with the operator groups. But with open source now gaining more and more prominence, is that relationship changing, evolving, or deepening? And how would you actually describe that change?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I must say, and I want the audience to really recognize that some of the people sitting on this stage, along with their management, senior management, I truly admire them for the courage, because these are the change agents that are really bringing that change to these big organizations that were so used to doing things in a certain way. And these people were able to kind of look in the future and say, no, we need to change. And you know that anytime you try to change something from within, you meet the immune system of the organization. And these people, hats off to them for persisting with that and really bringing about that change. So we are delighted to work with all these partners over the years. But I think in the end, the goal is to really, as Michal was saying, for the operators to really take control of their networks. Yeah. Because we still believe that it's not just about doing something that somebody else was doing. I think in my mind, it is really about, and Guru mentioned this in his keynote as well, that once the operators start taking control of their stack, there are new opportunities that we can bring about, new services, because they understand the network better than anybody else. Even though somebody else was providing you with all these capabilities, at the end of the day, operators operated those networks, and they were tied, they were close to their customers and how their customers actually use their networks. So if they have a better understanding of their own stack and everything, I think new services can be perceived, developed, and deployed much more quickly, and then actually taken away. Means if something didn't work, you can easily kill it because it's all software at the end of the day. So I think in the end, it will enable us to a new paradigm where really, really valuable services are going to get developed very quickly that the consumers in the end will benefit from. So.
Thanks. So Doug, AT&T has been at the forefront of embracing open source, as you rightfully mentioned. And indeed, AT&T has pushed out a lot of open source seed code out to the public. So you also mentioned that, as AT&T, you've been using open source in most things, and it was easier to talk about what areas that you were not using. So I'm guessing already your answer, but what do you foresee as sort of in the progression of embracing open source in the different aspects of the wireless network? What would be the last frontier?
The last frontier? Wow. Well, I think first off, the ecosystem for 5G is sort of open source wise is going on in parallel. So it's not like one area and is serially going to be done and then the next and next. The last frontier to me is probably going to be the control plane of the core.
Okay.
We already have a lot of activity going on in the RAN. Maybe the RRH would be also be there, but you can see a lot of the CU and DU on the RAN. There's a lot of work going on there with ORAN, et cetera. They're doing an awesome job, and they're just getting started. I think the user plane of the core is going to be fairly quickly evolved to open source in many different form factors. To me, that's sort of a no-brainer. The core, the guts of the mobility management, the management and state, and all of this complexity that really makes mobility hard, to me is and the fact that I think most service providers are going to have one or a few of those solution sets because it's just so difficult. I think those will be that's the last frontier from my perspective.
Okay.
I think we'll get there, and there'll be a lot of components that'll be reused from the open source community. But I think that entire function, there's 13 or so different functions in the 5G core. It's going to take a while for that to mature in the open source world.
One question to all of you, I mean, this has been actually asked for the last panel, is cellular networks is one where interoperability globally is super important, and that's why we have 3GPP standards. But now that open source is gaining more and more prominence, the capability to test out new ideas is a lot faster. So how does that interplay moving forward? How does that need to be in your mind so that 3GPP and the open source world can work more closely, and open source could be a catalyst for maybe faster 3GPP turnarounds moving forward?
Well, I think, well, let me say for the last question, that was a great response. And I do say, though, I don't know when the end litmus test is, but my understanding based off conversations today is we'll end up at the beach. And so once we're at the beach, right, we've met that objective. Good. So, but I think a couple things. One, I know that there's things like the ETSI new work model and other efforts that are there that are focused on making the standards organizations more efficient. Mm-hmm. And so, what we expect to see is a bit more of that. Two, I think the way I kind of view interoperability, right, is it can happen in a couple ways. It can happen proactively through a standard, through an organization as a written document. Yep. And it can happen proactively in a sense through code. Now, it's a lot harder when you have two different projects and it's happening through code without looking at a base document. So you have to have the two projects to come to some agreement. So it ends up being far more reactive. So the only way you can really get super fast kind of code-based interoperability is really using the same code. And I find the odds of that, unless it's a project that really catches fire, right, being fairly low. So I see with things like new work models and the pressure, right, coming from code-based momentum, right, putting a real emphasis on optimizing and streamlining the standards. And I think they'll adapt. I mean, we've had to adapt over the years from open source, from proprietary. So you'll see that side of the ecosystem adapt, I think, and adjust accordingly.
I think Tom Anschutz, also from AT&T, mentioned that, I think that, I'll paraphrase, but essentially they'll work together. Yep. The open community, not just open source software, but openness is really what we're after. So one way to get openness and interoperability is with standards. A way of showing that you can create new openness could be with open source software. So to me, they will work together to drive the industry forward. You can't start with chaos, right? That just doesn't work. I agree that many people feel that 3GPP is too slow. Is just one example of a slow organization, I guess. Although in some regards, making the leap to another generational network seems like it's going faster than what people want. So there's both this dichotomy that's happening at the moment. But I think one of the things that, at least from my perspective, is that in some of the areas where we think we're too slow is because of the suppliers of the software or the solutions are looking at what they need to do to support the new thing. And if they have to do it by themselves, then it's hard. So I'm hoping with the open source community, we can break down some of those barriers for development, and then all it then requires is writing down what you want to do.
Yeah.
I know it's not just that easy, but I think it's going to be much faster in the future.
I absolutely agree that the 3GPP needs to adapt. That's absolutely without any discussion. However, I think that we cannot underestimate the importance of the standardization in the context of ONF or open source early adoption, especially early, on an early stage, because we need some reference points in order to verify if something is working correctly or not.
Sure.
And I experience this in my daily business, like typically there is a case like, I don't know, some parameter is not being passed, and now the fundamental question is it should be included, some vendor-specific attribute or some attribute should be included or not should be included, yeah? And now you need to have a certain sort of arbiter, like, you know, to say like, okay, according to this and that specification, it should be working, especially that we are talking about, you know, it's a little bit like a heart transplantation, yeah? So it's not only like we are putting a completely new network. We are trying to implement a certain ingredients which are new, but those ingredients will be working completely with this old ecosystem. So for example, in the context of lightweight EPC, we are talking with the SGSN MME, or we are talking with radio. I'm saying about the user plane, which is absolutely, you know, legacy.
Sure.
And I cannot say like, okay, now I don't have a clue. It should work, yeah? You know, in astronomy, there is this magic sort of type of the star, which is acting as a reference to measure the distance, yeah? I am always treating the 3GPP sort of reference exactly the same one. Like, okay, if you have a fight, and that was even present in the old world of vendor to vendor. You have run from Ericsson, I don't know, Core from Nokia, whatever, and something is not working, and there is a fight, and there is a steering board escalation, and you know, there needs to be some referee finally saying like, guys, according to this and that 3GPP specification, it should be like this, and without any discussion. And I think that on this early stage, this is absolutely super important, especially that I don't see a super supportive role from the legacy vendors, helping us to, you know, to swap themselves. Yeah.
Perfect. How are we with time?
Yeah, no, I think we need to kind of wrap up.
Okay.
7 minutes.
All right. Maybe one last very, very quick question is, again, this is going to be maybe somewhat contentious, is cellular networks is also very heavily IPR protected. So how do you see moving more and more into an open source based environment? How will that play out?
It's your perfect time.
We seem to have solved that with Linux, right? Well, a couple things, right? So what I always advise people at the end of the day, right, if you're contributing or using, always consult with your internal legal teams. That's what they're there for, right? And make sure you're always compliant with your company's policy. I mean, that's just job one. It should be a no-brainer, but I'm always a little worried when I have to remind people. That being said, right, there are vehicles, right, and mechanisms out there established by a lot of these organizations like 3GPP in terms of IPR, and they're established processes. I think what you should always do is be proactive, right? Don't wait in this. Engage early if you think, because it takes a while for you to understand the processes and to get it right. And when you find out there's a problem, right, I think the worst thing you can do is just sit on it, right? I think that at that point, right, we have no idea whether you had, most people don't wake up in the morning with evil intent. So I think if they do, we call them villains. I think that's the definition. But basically, right, once you find an issue, right, go ahead and be proactive, address it earlier than later. And 9 times out of 10, a lot of the big scary things that people seem to think about with open source and IPR and this sort of stuff, it's not as present as you think. It's not as prevalent as you think. I think the thing that people have the largest risk of, and they don't realize, is when a developer goes out for help out on one of these websites where you can ask a question. I'm trying to code this, and I don't understand. And someone, once again, goodwill, right, copies something from a project or website. I think this may help you. Not understanding the implications in terms of IPR and copyright. And so that individual thanks them, pulls it into the project, and all of a sudden you've now got some challenges. So I know in OMEC we have some processes in place to prevent that. And so that's great. That's not true in every project. But those are the sort of things you need to think about. And in my opinion, that's probably the largest ongoing risk. I think where there's an established process, get in there early, run through the process, you'll be fine.
Okay. Yeah, I think people just need to get the new hygiene, right? This open source has a certain hygiene that you need to maintain. And one thing, kind of you didn't mention it, but you alluded in your question. I just want to mention that open doesn't mean free.
Of course. Yeah.
Right? So I think there are so many times people think of open source as like, if I adopt this, then how do I make money, or how do I capture value? And what we have seen, having participated in this open ecosystem for so many years, is that open just means that you are growing the pie and you are increasing the overall value so that more and more people can capture value by bringing their innovation to it, rather than keeping a fixed pie and then everybody worries about which piece of that pie I get. And that is where a lot of these issues come into play. But if you are thinking about growing the pie and moving the ball forward, I think that is enough for everybody to capture value.
There is one tiny little challenge related.
Michael, sorry.
Yeah, sure.
I think we're running out of time. Unfortunately, actually, we're running over. And I can see the clock here is actually off. So it's
is it?
for you guys, right?
We are
so let's all thank the panel very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.